February 2nd, 2021. The clock had just struck 10:43 p.m. At that moment, a frantic 911 call came through. "Oh my God, she shot herself," the man on the line screamed. By the time officers arrived, Dan was outside shaking, insisting it was an accident. But inside the house, they found a chilling scene. Kendy's lifeless body submerged in the bathtub, a gunshot wound to her head, and the gun resting eerily at the bottom of the tub. Dan claimed it all started with a fight about money. He said Kendy grabbed the gun, it fired through the floor, and then she went upstairs to cool off in a bath. He remained downstairs in front of the TV till he heard a faint thud. He never went upstairs to check on her for more than an hour. Meanwhile, Kendy was already gone. But something about the story was off. A stray gunshot? A long delay? And the gun? Why was it in the tub? Was it really a tragic accident or something much darker? Undoubtedly, Dan looked shattered, but something about the whole scene didn't sit right. There was broken glass near the window, clothes scattered on the floor, and wet towels behind the bathroom door. This whole setup raised a lot of questions, especially since Dan used to be a trooper with the Idaho State Police, a man who perhaps knew how to put together a crime scene if anyone did. Deputy Miranda Thomas, one of the first on the scene, said that Dan was freaking out, but curiously, no tears. He said he found Kendy in the tub with her gun at the bottom. But there were a few weird details. For starters, there was a packed duffel bag inside the house as if someone had been getting ready to leave. Then there was the dryer running at midnight full of clean towels. Such a strange time to be doing laundry. Dan also came out with freshly applied deodorant, looking groomed with clean clothes on. And that's weird for someone who just found his wife's body. Detectives even found deodorant marks on his shirt, meaning he just applied the deo after finding Kendy's body. That's weird. The experiences at these crime scenes put even seasoned crime scene experts, like Detective Jerry Northrup, to a test. A woman found dead in a bathtub from a gunshot wound was unusual enough, but hardly any blood only made things worse. The victim, Kendy Howard, had always been full of life, outgoing, sporty, and the apple of everyone's eye, especially her daughter, Brooke Wilkins. Her best friend, Michelle Lampert, and her family all were shocked to know about her sudden death. Kendy had been married to Dan for a long time. Dan, a former Idaho State Police trooper, was Kendy's husband since she was 22 years old. Together, they had a son, Wyatt, who joined the Marines, and they built a pretty solid life, stacking up over $2 million in assets. They were portrayed as the perfect couple on the outside, but inside there was tension, particularly regarding money. Dan was extremely tight about spending, which irritated Kendy. Things took a dark turn after Dan was involved in a fatal shooting while being held up during a traffic stop. Kendy started to have mental issues, and friends began to notice depression. Eventually, after that, Dan quit the police force, and that seemed to change everything in their relationship. To help out, Kendy's brother, Brian, got Dan a job in Alaska working the oil fields. Dan would work 3 weeks up north, then come home for 3 weeks. While he was away, Kendy had some space, and that gave her time to rethink things. She started complaining how miserable she was to Dan, telling him that she was no longer in love with him. She eventually slept with another guy, even started making plans for plastic surgery. She was also looking to buy her new dream home, meaning she was planning to get out of that marriage. And by the end of January 2021, just days before her death, Kendy had seen a divorce lawyer and had begun to make arrangements to leave Dan. She informed him about her decision when he returned home, and though he remained calm, there was something that didn't feel right for Kendy. His response was not exactly what she expected, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The day Kendy died, she had been discovered in her bathtub with a gunshot wound through the back of her mouth, and the gun was floating in the water. Definitely, Dan was quick to say that Kendy had taken her own life, but her family and friends weren't so sure. Brian and Michelle couldn't buy the suicide story. They said Kendy had been all about her future. She had been working on her fitness and even prepping for plastic surgery, none of which seemed like the mindset of someone planning to end it all. When Brian heard the news, he rushed straight to Kendy's place and confronted Dan. Dan did not seem too bothered, though. He did not even cry at that. Brian asked him straight up if he had hurt Kendy, but Dan shunned eye contact and denied it. On the other side, Kendy's neighbor, Carrie Maitland, had another story of her own. She said Kendy had been pretty down in the months before she died. Apparently, she'd go on and on to Carrie about her miserable marriage, and even said she felt worthless at times. Carrie thought that it was probably suicide, however, some things just didn't add up. Detective Jerry Northrup carried out further investigations to find something amiss in Dan's account. When the first responders arrived, Kendy House's dryer still had 6 minutes to go on that cycle. While Northrup kept on digging further, he found that the dryer had started operating just a little after the 911 call. This didn't jive with Dan's version of events. He said he was too distraught to be able to do anything for Kendy when he came upon her. That little detail put me on high alert. Now, having done a little more investigation, even more bizarre things started coming out of the woodwork. They also discovered broken glass in the master bedroom, and the blood in the bathtub didn't add up. It seemed too light for a head wound. The blood seemed infected, as if the water had been tampered with. Northrup suspected that someone had really put on a show. Detective Sergeant Ken Layton wasn't quite as convinced about Dan's account of their messed-up marriage. Something felt too rehearsed, too off. He began to suspect Dan might have been in on the whole ruse. We already gave the story Dan told the cops about what transpired, how she died, and how he heard a faint thud. But Layton could not accept the thud part of the story. With Dan's law enforcement experience and familiarity with firearms, it was a mystery why he could easily attribute a shooting to a simple thud. The following morning, Dan phoned his stepdaughter, Brooke, to report on Kendy's death. The conversation was fiery because the authorities had tapped the phone to overhear them. Even though Layton couldn't hear exactly what Brooke said, he could tell she was furious, shouting at Dan Howard and accusing him of being the one responsible for her mother's death. Layton couldn't shake how strong her reaction was. It's pretty rare for a family member to accuse a stepfather of murder, especially in a case that was supposed to be a suicide. It was a powerful moment, and Layton noticed how Dan Howard seemed to shrink under the weight of Brooke's accusations. From Layton's experience, it was unusual to see someone with Howard's background, law enforcement and military, being attacked so openly, especially by a family member. It struck him as something worth paying attention to. It was early in the morning on February 3, 2021, when detectives in Kootenai County started to have serious doubts about Dan Howard's involvement in his wife Kendy's death. Dan tried to deny it, but when Detective Sergeant started grilling him, he got defensive, which only made the detectives more suspicious. After all, Dan had been a cop himself, so they knew he was well aware of how to cover his tracks, especially when it came to staging a crime scene. But there wasn't enough physical evidence to pin anything on him just yet. The autopsy later revealed that Kendy had been shot, which raised even more questions, especially since Brooke mentioned that her mom didn't even own a gun. Things took a darker turn when Kootenai County prosecuting attorney Stan Mortensen got involved. As the investigation dug deeper, some shocking details about Dan's past came to light. Back in 2013, when he was still a state trooper, Dan had found out that Kendy was having an affair with a neighbor, who, to make things worse, was a close friend of his. Dan was furious, and he confronted the neighbor, threatening to kill him. This resulted in multiple felony charges, and Dan ended up pleading guilty and serving a few months in jail. After that, he was allowed to resign from the Idaho State Police. After this incident, things between Dan and Kendy went downhill fast. People who knew them, like Kendy's friend Michelle, noticed a change in Kendy's behavior. She started depending on Dan more and more, which made Michelle wonder if she was scared of him. Michelle even saw how controlling Dan was, especially when it came to Kendy's money. But whenever Dan was away for work, Kendy seemed to loosen up and enjoy a little more freedom, which only made their already rocky relationship even worse. 7 months before she passed away, Kendy Howard got into a big fight with her partner, Dan. It all started when she found some credit card bills that Dan had been hiding. Things got heated, and during the argument, Dan physically held her down, leaving bruises on her neck, which Kendy actually took pictures of. But despite the evidence, she never went to the cops. Her friends had no idea how long the abuse had been going on, but it had been happening for at least 6 months. Just 4 nights before Kendy's death, her mom called the deputies for a welfare check. She'd heard Kendy sounding scared over the phone. When the deputies arrived, Kendy was really shaken up. She had just told Dan she wanted a divorce, which didn't sit well with him. While talking to the deputy, Kendy went to grab something from her bedroom, and the deputy followed her inside. Kendy did tell him things had gotten tense, but she didn't mention anything about being physically hurt, so the authorities couldn't arrest Dan. Still, Kendy had already told her friends about something disturbing that had happened. She woke up one morning to find Dan standing over her, dressed in all black, wearing black latex gloves, and holding a pillow. She was terrified, convinced he was planning to kill her. But after that, Kendy went home later that day telling everyone that she didn't think Dan would try anything like that again, and that she felt a bit safer. The real heartbreak in this story is that Kendy was so close to getting out of this abusive relationship. She was planning to leave him, and things were starting to unravel for Dan. A few days before Kendy died, Dan called Kendy's brother Brian, asking about an affair Kendy was supposedly having with her real estate agent, who was helping her buy a new house. Brian remembers how angry Dan got when he found out Kendy was seeing the agent. And the very next day, Kendy was found dead. So here's the thing, when the authorities showed up and started looking around the scene, they found a bunch of nasty injuries on Kendy. There were bruises, cuts, and even a broken jaw, which definitely made it clear that she'd been beaten up pretty badly. But the suspicious thing was the gunshot wound. Kendy was found in the bathtub with a bullet lodged in her mouth, and it had gone all the way into her spine. Now, even though there was this gunshot, the investigators thought she was probably already dead when it happened. It was like someone had tried to make it look like the gunshot killed her, but it didn't. It was more like part of the setup to make the crime scene look a certain way. The medical examiner initially said Kendy died from the gunshot, and there wasn't any DNA linking Dan directly to the gun. So, the prosecution decided to bring in Dr. Jennifer Nara, a forensic pathologist, to take another look at everything. She went through all the reports, photos, x-rays, and toxicology results, and after all that, she disagreed with the original cause of death. What she focused on was the angle of the bullet. It came into Kendy's mouth and went down, which was super weird for a gunshot wound, especially if it was supposed to be a suicide. To prove her point, Dr. Nara used a skull model to show exactly how the bullet would have traveled through Kendy's mouth, and it just didn't line up with how gunshots typically happen. Plus, there was barely any blood at the scene, even though a wound like that would have caused a lot of bleeding. It raised the suspicion even more, so it was more or less clear that Kendy wasn't taking her own life. She was attacked and murdered by Dan, her husband. It was Dan who first assaulted her physically. The gunshot came after she was already dead. That led the prosecutors to believe that Dan used a move called a carotid restraint, basically choking someone until they passed out. He'd learned it back when he was a state trooper. While there wasn't solid proof he did it, the fact that he had this knowledge made it the most likely explanation. On top of that, Dan was also hit with a domestic battery charge for something that happened 7 months before Kendy's death, when she'd taken photos of her injuries from him. He pleaded not guilty, though, and was granted bail, but he had to wear an ankle monitor while awaiting trial. And finally, at the trial in March 2024, they decided to leave out Dan Howard's past criminal history, including a previous incident where he was involved in a killing during a traffic stop back in 2011. The prosecutor, Stan Mortensen, argued that Dan and his wife Kendy had been fighting over money, and things got physical. Mortensen said Dan first used a cord to strangle Kendy, then staged the scene by putting her body in the bathtub and shooting her afterward. He insisted that the evidence would show Kendy didn't die from suicide, but from being suffocated, and that Dan was definitely guilty of murder. Dan's defense lawyer, Jason Johnson, wasn't having any of that. He argued that Kendy's death was actually a suicide. He said Kendy had been emotionally struggling, especially with the idea of leaving Dan, and that could have driven her to take her own life. Johnson pointed out that Dan's DNA wasn't on the gun Kendy used, and though Kendy's blood was found on it, they couldn't link Dan to it. He also shot down the prosecution's theory of a fight between Dan and Kendy, saying there weren't any signs of struggle on Kendy's body, like defensive wounds or DNA under her nails, which you'd expect if she had fought back. Then Johnson raised some doubts about the crime scene itself. He suggested that the lack of visible blood could be explained by the fact that they didn't photograph the scene right away, and some of the blood might have drained out over time. He also called out the prosecution's claim that Kendy had been suffocated before being shot, and brought in the original autopsy from the medical examiner. That expert said Kendy died from a gunshot wound, not asphyxiation. So here's where things really took a crazy turn. During a long weekend break in the trial, prosecutors found out that Dan Howard, who was out on bail with an ankle monitor, had disappeared. After they finished presenting their evidence, they figured out he had left town. Finally, they tracked him down on I-90, where he was driving at 70 miles per hour. Then, out of nowhere, he suddenly took an exit, got back on the highway, and kept looking in his rearview mirror like he was checking to see if anyone was tailing him. An hour later, he pulled into Spokane International Airport, and that's where they caught him, right in the terminal. Dan tried to say he was just there to help a friend return a rental car and wasn't running away, but the cops didn't believe him. They thought he was actually planning to ditch his ankle monitor and skip town in a rental. So pretty quickly, they threw him back in jail, and his bail was officially revoked. Now, when the closing arguments came around, the prosecution laid it out hard. They argued that Kendy's death couldn't have been a suicide, especially since there was no way she could have shot herself in the mouth. Dan's defense lawyer, Jason Johnson, stuck to his guns, saying it was indeed a suicide and that the scene backed it up. He also tried to argue that Dan wouldn't have had the know-how to stage a murder, pointing out that there was zero evidence that Dan had any kind of special training for something like that. And after 10 days of trial and hearing from 62 witnesses, the jury took a little over 8 hours to come back with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Dan Howard didn't show a hint of emotion when they read it out loud, but you could see some people in the courtroom just breaking down in tears. Fast forward 2 months to his sentencing, and Dan's there pleading with the judge. He's begging for a lighter sentence, saying he loved his wife Kendy and missed her like crazy. He kept insisting he wasn't the monster the prosecution made him out to be, claiming people were turning on him. He talked about how he and Kendy had been together for 28 years, raised a family, and for the most part, had a good life. He said he was sorry, but also tried to make it clear he didn't mean to disrespect the court. But the judge wasn't having it, because clearly Kendy's death tore apart her family. She wasn't just a wife, but also a mother, grandmother, and sister. Her life was cut short because of Dan's own pride, greed, and anger. So do you think Dan should be considered for a lighter sentence? Moreover, do you think chances are Dan is not guilty, and it's really a suicide or something else had happened? You can share your theories in the comment box. We are all ears. And subscribe to this channel for more content like this. See you soon in our next video.